In 1864, Union soldiers smashed the iron doors of a basement beneath a Georgia plantation and found 23 children huddled in the dark. They shared the same uncanny stamp: high cheekbones, pale green eyes, auburn hair threaded with gold. The oldest, a girl of 13, looked up without flinching. "Mistress says we are her legacy," she told the men. "We cannot leave because we are her blood." The incident appears once, only once, in a confidential letter filed by the 34th Massachusetts Infantry, then buried for decades. Burke County histories don't mention Thornhill at all, as if the estate and its mistress never existed. But they did. And what Catherine Danforth Thornhill built in the 16 years between her husband's death and the arrival of federal troops is one of the bleakest chapters in American slavery, a deliberate, coded, ledger-bound breeding program designed to bind generations to her by blood. The story begins on a raw morning in February 1847. Catherine, 28, newly widowed, inherited 1,700 acres of red clay 7 miles southwest of Waynesboro, fields tired from monocrop cotton, barns patched with scrap, debts stacked like cordwood. Her husband, Jonathan Thornhill, had gambled away money and time. Winter fever finished him. What remained? 31 enslaved people, failing yields, and creditors closing in. Catherine had been raised to manage a grand household, not a collapse. Returning to Augusta to live under her father's roof meant failure she could not stomach. Buying more labor was impossible. Waiting 15 years for infants to become field hands was a fantasy. So, by candlelight over ledgers and legal threats, she sketched a plan as cold as it was practical. If she couldn't afford to purchase people, she would cultivate them systematically. She kept cultivation records in a simple cipher. Children were seedlings. Selected Mahawan and were rootstock. Pregnancies were plantings. She charted traits the way livestock breeders did: strength, eyesight, teeth, temperament. Her first selection was Isaac, 24, steady, powerful. In March 1847, she summoned him to the main house after dark. Her journal entry for that night is dry as bone. First planting completed with rootstock. 1. Weather mild. By April, she believed herself pregnant. In December, she delivered a son. She named Jonathan after her late husband, and passed him off as premature. Timing be damned. When her teenage stepson, Richard, stumbled over her ciphered book and broke it, he understood what he was reading and what it made him. He tried to act. Then he sickened. Fatigue, stomach pain, weakness. Catherine served his meals herself and spoke gently about consumption, while the midwife prescribed a tonic. Richard knew better. He had read about arsenic. He wrote a letter begging his grandfather in Augusta for help. A servant, terrified of Catherine, delivered the letter, right back to the mistress. Catherine burned it in front of him. Richard died on December 3, 1847. The doctor wrote consumption and went home. From 1848 to 1856, Thornhill's fortunes appeared to revive. Cotton yields rose. Debts shrank. Catherine gave birth 4 more times, then 3 more, sons and daughters sired by men she chose, men who could not refuse. She sold Isaac West when his presence became inconvenient, and kept the wig of charity draped over her cruelty. The children of her body, registered in county books as enslaved, lived in the big house, ate better food, wore decent clothes, learned to read and write in secret. She told them they were fortunate orphans. She groomed them for the next phase: pairings, pregnancies, production. When pregnancies occurred outside her design, the midwife administered abortifacients in a back room. One woman, Ruth, ran rather than submit. Dogs pulled her from the pines. The procedure went ahead. She lived, but something in her did not. Another girl, Sarah, only 14, was forced into a marriage with a man more than twice her age and died in childbirth at 15. Catherine spoke of duty to the estate. The quarters spoke in whispers and buried their dead. By 1859, Catherine had added a heritage room in the east wing, windowless, lamplit, lined with shelves. Here she stored her journals, glass vials labeled with locks of hair, and hand-drawn family trees that were not families at all, but breeding diagrams. She planned pairings into the 1870s, as if war, politics, and human will could be kept outside her whitewashed walls. Then the country tore itself apart. Secession, war, shortages. News traveled along enslaved networks faster than the mistress guessed. Catherine tightened the leash, curfews, patrols, smaller rations, and accelerated the timetable. In February 1863, she staged a sham wedding for her eldest Jonathan, 15, pairing him with Rachel, 16. He obeyed. Rachel went silent. The quarters took note. That spring, Elena, sharp-eyed, restless, full, and an unlocked journal, and cracked the cipher Catherine had taught her to love. She read the entry that named her father, Rootstock 2, Thomas, excellent back, good teeth, and the pairing Catherine had planned for her with a boy not yet born. She confronted Catherine. The mask slipped. Catherine threatened sale and separation, the whip and the auction block wrapped in maternal rhetoric. Elena told her siblings anyway. Some refused to see the cage. Others saw nothing else. In August, when a pregnant girl named Grace tried to flee toward the Savannah River, Catherine had her dragged back and whipped before everyone, including the children from the big house. The punishment did not break the quarters. It confirmed what they already knew. The mistress was afraid, and fear meant she could be made to fall. In March 1864, Confederate cavalry stopped for a night and spoke too loudly about Sherman and defeat. Hope crackled through the quarters. Catherine felt it and chose her answer. On March 17th, she gathered her 11 children in the heritage room, lit the lamps, and showed them shelves of hair, stacks of charts, the museum of their captivity. From a locked cabinet, she produced vials. "A medicine," she said softly. "In larger doses, eternal peace. If the Yankees come, they will tear us apart. Better to stay together." Jonathan stepped between her and the bottles. Elena stood beside him. They called her what she was. Catherine grabbed the journals, the charts, the vials. If she could not keep the creation, she would preserve the record, and fled into the yard toward the quarters. What happened next lives in fragments. People spilled from cabins, papers scattered, glass shattered. Someone lit a fire. When the smoke cleared, the charts were ash, the vials ground into mud, the journals torn. Catherine Danforth Thornhill was gone. The overseer searched. The sheriff wrote that she had fled in fear of the Yankees. In the quarters, a woman named Hope said only, "She's gone, and she ain't coming back." The children said nothing. Justice of a kind had arrived. Freedom followed in 1865. Most people left Thornhill at once, hunting for family, or simply for air that wasn't hers. Elena stayed a while, then moved to Savannah, married, kept her past locked away. Jonathan tried to make the land work, then vanished west under another name. The house burned partially in 1871. The county sold the land for taxes in 1878. A well digger found a woman's skeleton in a cistern. 1860s dress scraps, a broken skull, a locket with 2 miniatures. The coroner wrote, "Unknown female." The black community did not. Years later, a Union captain's letter surfaced describing systematic breeding at a place called Thornhill and a mistress who disappeared, and that he would not pursue the matter further. 23 children from that basement were placed with freed families, their lives scattered into silence. Somewhere, people still carry the cheekbones, the pale eyes, the copper-gold hair. They do not know her name. That is its own justice. If this unsettled you, it should. Stories like this linger because people decided not to forget, and others decided not to speak. Both choices can be right. What matters is the clarity we carry forward. Some legacies deserve to vanish. The people who survive them do not. And because some legacies refuse to stay buried, the story kept surfacing in courthouse dust, in church kitchens after Sunday service, in the pauses elders took between sentences. Decades after the war, Thornhill became a rumor you could walk through. Hunters swore they'd seen a rectangle of white brick deep in the pines, a chimney with nothing to warm, a cellar mouth full of frog song. Children dared each other to stand on the portico steps that weren't there anymore and listen for iron hinges. When the timber company finally shaved the land to stubble and pulp, they turned up old nails bent like question marks, and a brass door plate stamped T, polished by rain into a faint mirror of anyone who lifted it. A county clerk, long retired, liked to tell a story in the barber's chair about a ledger he once took home by accident, the 1859 tax volume, because a storm cut the lights, and he didn't trust the courthouse roof. He claimed he found a torn leaf stuffed between pages, a list of names in a woman's hand, each with a date and a single word beside it. Planted, planted, planted. He burned the slip in his sink, he said, then stopped going to church for a month. The Lord knew anyway, he whispered, as if confession were a kind of weather. By 1923, the land had a new name on the plat, but the old one clung like red dust. That year, a farmer digging a drainage ditch found glass buttons and the corner of a cedar box. Inside was a ribbon, turned the color of tea, and a miniature painted on ivory, a child with eyes too light for the Georgia sun. The farmer's wife kept it in a teacup on the mantel. When visitors asked, she'd say it was somebody else's trouble, and that was the end of it. The archive trail, such as it is, runs like a creek that vanishes underground and reappears where you don't expect it. In 1954, a graduate student cataloging Reconstruction correspondence noted a captain's letter about experiments at a plantation no map clerk could place anymore. She typed a summary on an index card and slid it into a drawer marked Cotton, Economy. Years later, a janitor cleaning out that drawer stacked the cards by color and tossed the white ones. The student's carbon copy survived because it was blue. A single name kept bobbing up like a cork. Hope. A woman who had watched children be named not for kin, but for a season on a ledger. A woman who had stood in a yard under stars and said the words that turned a crowd from spectators into actors. Her granddaughter wrote that short memoir in Savannah, the one with a paragraph about the night the devil mistress disappeared. The original was handwritten on grocery ledgers. The family typed it up in the 1970s and stapled it into a church cookbook as a testimony. If you ask to see it now, the deacon will bring it in a zip bag and set it down like an heirloom pistol. Dangerous if you don't know what you're touching. As for the 23 children in the basement, the record after 1865 is more absence than ink. A few names surface in Friedman's bureau lists: Jonah, 10, Mary, 8. Twins unnamed, about 6. A church register in Girard notes a baptism for E.T. of no fixed parentage, and in the margin a quiet prayer: God gather the scattered. A tailor's bill from Augusta carries the line, buttons for J.T. boy with green eyes. And you wonder if the merchant wrote that because it startled him, or because he needed to remember which boy owed him 40 cents. Memory does what it must to make the past survivable. Some families pass the story down like a hot coal, quickly, hand to hand, never holding it long. Others smothered it under blankets of silence. A woman in Port Wentworth kept a lock of auburn hair in a locket, and told her daughters it belonged to a cousin on the good side of the river. One of those daughters grew old and resolute, and returned the locket to the earth behind her church, where the roots could have it. Every generation found its own language. In the 1930s, the WPA interviewers heard, "Bad woman did bad things." In the 1960s, it became eugenics, a word that takes cruelty and gives it a Latin spine. In the 1990s, when television discovered the South as a set piece, Thornhill was almost a plot line, then wasn't. A producer toured Burke County, filmed the courthouse steps, shot a stand of oaks at magic hour, and decided America wasn't ready for a story where the villain wasn't a man with a whip, but a woman with a pen. And then there is the bone logic of the body itself. Features that echo down a line, even when names do not. You still meet people in central Georgia with eyes that startle in certain light, or hair that glints copper in August heat. They joke about Scots blood, or a great-granddaddy from somewhere colder. They are not wrong. They are also not entirely right. Blood is a story other people wrote about you. The truth sits deeper than ink. One autumn not long ago, a teacher from Waynesboro, history, 7th grade, took his class on a Saturday cleanup of a neglected cemetery. He was the kind who believed place could teach what textbooks couldn't. The children hauled off branches, scrubbed lichen tablets, and read names aloud. In a cracked corner, they found slate markers with only initials and years: M. 1863, J.T. 1891. They asked why some stones had no full names. He told them about money, cord keeping, and what it meant to live in a world that refused to write you down. He did not tell them about Thornhill. Not then. He wasn't ready to tug a thread that could pull the whole county down around them. But it tugged itself. One girl, bright and stubborn, looked up old maps online and brought him a photocopy of an 1860 survey with a rectangle where no house stood now. Was this it? She asked. He didn't answer. She wrote a paper anyway. Lost Houses of Burke County, and left Thornhill to a half sentence and an asterisk. That asterisk was more honest than most paragraphs. If you go out there today, down the farm road that turns to sand, past the ditch choked with Johnson grass, into the stand of second-growth pine, you will find almost nothing. A scatter of brick, a hinge buried and freckled with rust, the lip of a sunken rectangle that might once have been a basement. In summer, the air tastes like sap and iron. In winter, when the light goes thin and the ground shows its ribs, you can make out the line where a fence must have run. You can stand in that emptiness and hear the wind go through the needles like far-off water and decide that absence is safer than truth. Or you can do what the past asks, which is always the same thing. Look longer. Look until you see the heritage room without walls, shelves sworn to secrecy, lamps turned low, charts that pretended to be family trees. Look until you see a young man writing the same sentence in a small notebook until the words blur. I did not choose this. Look until you see a girl with a cipher in her lap and a face held very still as she learns what language can do when it is used against you. Look until you see a circle of women in the woods, their knees touching, deciding where the line runs between survival and justice and what it costs to cross it. Then look away, because a story like this is not a spectacle. It's a warning. What do we do with warnings? We carry them forward the way people in Thornhill's shadow did, carefully, with a kind of reverence for the pain inside them, and with a refusal to let them become a blueprint. We teach the younger ones to spot the signs, ledgers that rename people as yields, policies that sound like mercy but function like cages, inheritance dressed up as destiny. We tell them, power loves a spreadsheet, and will call it providence if you let it. We tell them that erasure is itself a tool, and that sometimes the only monument the hurt will ever get is the discipline of remembering. There is no neat ending here. The cistern holds its secret. The locket sleeps under churchyard soil. The index card that could have saved a researcher a decade of hunting is gone with the janitor's trash. Maybe that is fitting. Some stories will not be archived like butterflies, pinned, labeled, solved. Some insist on remaining a living thing that flits just out of reach, demanding you feel its shadow rather than count its spots. If you're still with me, hear this part clearly. The point of telling Thornhill is not to bathe in darkness. It's to develop night vision. It's to train the eye to catch the small movements, the new euphemisms, the polished ledgers, the plans that sound efficient and arrive without empathy. It's to stand in the empty pine stand and understand that places remember what people try to forget. And if, on some winter afternoon, you meet a stranger with eyes like pale glass and a quick, reluctant smile, be gentle. History does not only live in courthouses. Sometimes it walks past you on a sidewalk, unaware of the map it carries in its bones. What survives isn't always written in ink. Sometimes it's carried in posture, the way someone hesitates before saying where their family came from, or the silence that settles when a certain name is mentioned. Burke County still has silences like that. Whole stretches of road where conversation falters for no reason people can explain. Ask enough questions and you'll start to hear the same phrases, worn smooth by time. That land was cursed. That family didn't last. They built on something that shouldn't have been touched. No one says Thornhill. They just point a little south of Waynesboro and change the subject. There's a place the locals call the Hollow. In summer, it's a green tangle of pine and vine. But when the frost comes, the ground gives up its shapes. Brick footings, the suggestion of a staircase, an outline where a house might once have stood. Hunters say that when the fog hangs low, you can see a single column standing, though there's no foundation left to hold it. Teenagers, of course, made it a dare. Go to the Hollow after midnight, call out Mistress Thornhill, and see what answers. They never hear a ghost, only the wind, but always the same feeling afterward, that someone was listening, and maybe that's the truest haunting of all. Not a woman in white, not chains in the dark, but the echo of what a human being can convince herself is righteous if she wraps it in order and record-keeping. People think evil comes with madness or passion. Catherine Thornhill proved it also comes with symmetry, clean handwriting, and logic that forgets to bleed. Her journals were neat, her charts balanced. She called her atrocities cultivations, as if naming could cleanse them. That's what makes her story so dangerous, because that instinct to rename horror until it looks like progress never died. Look around and you'll see it wearing modern clothes. Metrics, productivity, optimization. Still the same seed, still the same hunger to make the living fit the plan. So when you think of Thornhill, don't look for ghosts, look for patterns. Whenever a system tells you that people are units to be improved or replaced, whenever empathy becomes inefficient, whenever bloodlines, purity, or perfection whisper through policy, hear the rustle of old paper in a locked room. That's Thornhill speaking. Maybe that's why the place won't quite fade. It's a reminder, carved into soil. That power, left unchecked, will always find a way to turn life into property. Every few years, an amateur historian writes to Burke County asking for access to the Thornhill files. The clerk sends the same reply. No surviving documents, no records, nothing to show. But in the courthouse basement, there's a cardboard box with no label, sealed with brittle tape. Inside are three things: a rusted key, a child's ivory button, and a scrap of paper bearing a single sentence written in 19th century ink. The harvest was larger than expected. No date, no signature, just that. And maybe that's all history ever really leaves us. Small fragments that ask more than they answer, daring us to decide what kind of people we want to be in the face of them. So if you ever find yourself driving through Burke County on a winter evening, when the sky is the color of pewter, and the fields look like the bones of the earth, stop for a moment. Step out. Feel how quiet it is. The wind moves through the pines like breathing. Somewhere under that red soil, stories are still turning over in their sleep, waiting for someone brave enough to listen without turning away. Because the past doesn't die. It waits patiently for the living to remember. Maybe that's what memory really is. Not a chain of dates or facts, but a haunting that insists on being felt. When you stand in a place like Thornhill, you're not just standing on history. You're standing on the unfinished business of human conscience. Even now, the land breathes. On still mornings, mist rises from the old fields in thin ribbons that catch the first light. Locals say it looks like smoke from a fire that never quite went out. They don't know how right they are. Because memory burns quietly. It doesn't vanish. It smolders, waiting for oxygen, for a voice to speak its name. Sometimes that voice arrives by accident. In 2014, a road crew widening the county highway unearthed bricks arranged in a neat rectangle. Beneath them, fragments of porcelain, glass, a tarnished locket, and what appeared to be pages of parchment fused together by age and damp. Archaeologists were called, of course. The site was sealed, then catalogued. Officially, the documents disintegrated before they could be read. Unofficially, one intern swore he saw words ghosting through the paper when it caught the sun. Rootstock, harvest, bloodline. The county buried the fragments again under a layer of gravel. Progress moved on. But whispers began circulating in Waynesboro's courthouse again. About the interns who refused to go back to the site. About one woman who said she woke each night to the sound of children whispering in a basement she didn't have. About a man who dreamt of a woman's voice reciting names in a tone that was half prayer, half inventory, maybe imagination, maybe guilt rediscovering itself. But that's the thing about evil. It leaves a residue. You can scrub it, rename it, pave it over, but it clings, because the past has its own way of auditing the living. Some nights, storm clouds gather low over Burke County. Lightning traces the horizon like handwriting, and thunder rolls over the land as if someone were turning the pages of an enormous, angry book. People lock their doors, dogs whine, and if you stand outside and listen hard enough, you might hear what sounds like a woman whispering through the rain, counting. Not names this time, just numbers, keeping her records. And that's the true horror of Thornhill. Not that one woman could do what she did, but that she believed she was justified, that she wrote it down, that she made the monstrous look methodical, and then passed that logic on to the world. Every society has its Thornhill, a place or a person who decides that control is cleaner than compassion. That order is worth more than freedom. You'll find it in boardrooms, laboratories, bureaucracies, screens. The tools have changed. The principle hasn't. That's why the story must be told, not to shock, but to inoculate. Because silence is where these things begin again. So the next time someone says the past is past, remember Burke County. Remember that 23 children once sat in a basement believing they were born from legacy instead of violence. Remember that their story was buried on purpose. And remember that the ground still moves when you speak their names aloud. If you listen long enough, you'll feel them in the air, not as ghosts, but as witnesses, not asking for pity, only for vigilance. Because forgetting is the first permission that history ever needs to repeat itself. And maybe that's what Thornhill's last lesson truly is. That evil doesn't end when the body dies. It ends when the story is told and believed. When the record, once written in cipher and blood, is finally read by someone who refuses to look away. It's strange how quiet the world becomes when a buried story finishes exhaling. But even now, even after all this, Thornhill doesn't rest. It waits, not for forgiveness, but for acknowledgement, for someone to stand in the ruins and say aloud, "I see you. I know what happened here." Because denial is its own kind of resurrection. Every time a society says that was long ago, Thornhill breathes again. In 2020, a historian from Emory University came to Burke County chasing a ghost footnote, a reference in an 1865 War Department letter marked Reynolds Report, Property T. It was buried in an appendix no one had opened in decades. The letter mentioned living evidence of biological servitude and an unrecovered matron, initials KT. That was all. The historian's name was Dr. Evelyn Gray. She wasn't looking for legends. She wanted data, census figures, property maps, genealogy records. But every line she followed led to the same absence. Families who appeared in 1840 and vanished by 1850. Acres that changed hands with no record of sale. Entire pages of county archives missing, as if erased by design. One afternoon, Evelyn found herself driving through back roads that weren't on her GPS. The woods pressed close, green and endless. Then she saw it, an open field, a dip in the land, and at its center, a scatter of brick bones. No markers, no signage, just ruin. She didn't know it then, but she was standing over the Thornhill cellar. Later that night, she recorded a voice memo. "There's something about the air here, still but not peaceful, like waiting for someone to listen. Soil feels heavy. Could be imagination, but I swear the silence has memory. 3 months later, she published an article called "The Plantation That Erased Itself." It made waves briefly, then vanished beneath election headlines. But buried in the footnotes was something extraordinary. Evelyn H. had matched DNA samples from unmarked graves in a nearby churchyard with living residents of Burke County. 3 families, all distant cousins, all sharing a distinctive genetic marker tied to Northern European ancestry. The same marker repeated in fragments among black families across Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina. None of them knew the name Thornhill. But their eyes, Evelyn wrote, were greenish, rare, and luminous under certain light. She ended the paper with one quiet sentence: "Legacy leaves fingerprints, even on those who never asked to inherit it." No one funded her follow-up study. The story was too raw, too dangerous, too close to truths modern Georgia prefers to call heritage instead of what it really was. But in Burke County, things started to shift. That fall, a local teacher, the same one who'd led his students to clean the forgotten cemetery, invited Evelyn to speak. She brought photocopies of census records, letters, and her research. She told the students that history is not a straight line, but a spiral. It returns, slightly altered, until someone breaks the pattern. She showed them the photo of the field where she'd stood, the sun setting behind the ruins. The children were silent for a long time. Then a boy in the front row, no older than 12, raised his hand. "What happened to the kids?" he asked. Evelyn paused. "They grew up," she said softly. "Some lived long lives, some didn't. But every one of them carried the proof that the system that made them could be broken, because they survived it." The room stayed silent after that. Not the silence of boredom or fear, but something heavier: reverence. Outside, the afternoon light turned the trees the color of rust, and for a moment the glass panes shimmered green. And maybe that's how Thornhill will end, not with ruins or revenge or discovery, but with understanding. Because every generation that dares to look honestly at what came before earns back a small piece of its humanity. The plantation's fields are quiet now. Pines reclaim the earth. Cicadas sing where overseers once shouted. The red clay keeps its secrets, but the wind remembers every name. So if you ever walk those woods, and the air feels thick, and the light catches just right, you might hear it, not a scream, not a ghost, just a whisper: "We are still here." And in that moment, you'll know what all this has been trying to say, that history isn't a chain of horrors meant to scare us. It's a mirror meant to wake us. Because Thornhill was never just a place in Georgia. It's a warning carved into the bones of civilization itself, of what happens when power forgets its reflection and when blood becomes just another line in a ledger. So remember the name. Not to keep it alive, but to keep it from happening again. And if you listen closely, the echo of that warning stretches beyond the pine trees and the broken soil of Burke County. It moves through time like a pulse, threading itself into every new era that swears it has nothing left to hide. But the past has a way of watching us. It waits behind progress, behind pride, behind every polite rewrite of memory. Every generation buries its Thornhill. Not always in plantations, sometimes in boardrooms, sometimes in policies written in clean fonts and vague language. sometimes in institutions that promise protection while quietly deciding who is worth saving. Because that's the cruel genius of Catherine Thornhill's legacy. She didn't invent evil. She organized it. She gave it structure, documentation, rationale. She turned it into a system that could survive without her. And once a system learns how to disguise cruelty as efficiency, it never fully dies. It simply evolves. Look around. We still measure value in output. We still rename exploitation as opportunity. We still tell ourselves that the cost of progress must be paid by someone else, someone further down the line, someone without a voice. That's Thornhill, wearing a new face, speaking in metrics and markets instead of chains and ledgers. And that's why the story must stay alive. Because remembering is not an act of nostalgia. It's an act of resistance. Evelyn Gray understood that before Ann Batson men, no one else did. In her last lecture before leaving Georgia, she stood in front of a class of undergraduates and said something that would outlive every paper she'd ever written. History isn't dead. It's just waiting for you to decide which parts of it you'll let live again. After her talk, she drove back out to the field one last time. It was winter. The pines had gone silver in the frost. The sun hung low, a dull coin behind clouds. She brought nothing but a notebook and a small glass jar. She scooped a handful of that red Georgia earth and sealed it inside. When she returned to Atlanta, she placed the jar on her desk beside her computer, not as a relic, but as a reminder. Every time she looked at it, she thought of those 23 children, not as victims, but as proof that survival itself is a form of defiance. Years later, when Evelyn died, her students found the jar still there, still sealed. They buried it in the university garden beneath a magnolia tree, without a plaque, without ceremony. They said the same words that had ended her final paper. Legacy leaves fingerprints, even on those who never asked to inherit it. Now, sometimes, when the wind moves through the magnolia leaves, you can hear them rattle softly, like pages turning. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the only justice the past ever truly gets is being remembered clearly enough that it can't disguise itself again. Because Thornhill's real ghost isn't the woman who built it. It's the idea she left behind, that bloodlines can be owned, that people can be engineered, that control is the same thing as order. That idea still walks among us, dressed in modern clothes, smiling behind glass screens. But so do the descendants of those who defied her. They carry her story not as a curse, but as armor. If you ever find one of them, maybe in a church choir, maybe at a school desk, maybe on a quiet back road at dusk, you'll know. Not because of their eyes, though sometimes they do shimmer pale green when the sun hits right. You'll know because they move through the world with an instinct their ancestor Hope once whispered in the woods. We do not wait for the world to free us. We free ourselves. That is Thornhill's truest ending. Not buried bones or haunted land, but endurance. The kind that outlasts every master's name. And if you're still listening now, remember this before you go. The past is not a place you leave behind. It is the soil beneath your feet. And every choice you make plants something in it, something that will either bloom in mercy or grow back into another Thornhill. Choose carefully, because soil remembers what's planted in it. Mercy or cruelty, both take root the same way. You can cover it with pavement, plant pine over it, rename it, forget it. But every rain pulls something old to the surface. That's what history does. It leaks. Decades after Dr. Evelyn Gray's death, the red earth of Burke County began to stir again, quietly. A small-town construction company bought the land once known as Thornhill, intending to build a gated community, the Oaks at Waynesboro. They brought in surveyors, engineers, investors. On the brochures, the soil looked tamed, redeemed, ready for new beginnings. But before the first foundation was poured, the workers found bones. They stopped the machines. A dozen skeletons, all small, children, arranged in a circle beneath the packed clay, as if laid down carefully, deliberately. No markers, no coffin wood left, just earth and silence. DNA confirmed what the past had whispered. Mid-19th century origin, African ancestry mixed with traces of European bloodlines. Ages between 5 and 14. The developers hushed the discovery. Old family cemetery, they said. Slaves, probably. But the archaeologists who came after ours, the ones who read Evelyn Gray's forgotten paper, knew better. They had seen the archives, the sketches, the ciphered pages that had survived in fragments. These weren't random burials. They were arranged in a pattern, a spiral, turning inward, just like the family charts Catherine Thornhill had drawn in her heritage room. When they unearthed the center of the spiral, they found something stranger still, a rusted key. No door for it, no lock nearby. But its handle bore a faint engraving. KT. That key sits today in a climate-controlled drawer at Emory University, sealed under glass. There's a note beside it, written in a curator's hand. Artifact recovered from Thornhill site, 2027. The key does not fit any known door. Maybe that's the point. Since then, the Thornhill property has remained undeveloped. Locals say nothing grows right there. The pine saplings twist in odd directions. Animals avoid it. On summer nights, when fog rolls in from the river, the air tastes like iron, old, metallic, restless. But every so often, someone leaves flowers by the chain-link gate. No note, no name, just wild flowers, red, yellow, purple, laid in a circle. Somebody remembers. And maybe that's all the story ever wanted. Not fame, not absolution, just remembrance. Because every act of remembrance, however small, is a rebellion against erasure. It is the refusal to let silence rewrite truth. The Thornhill children never had graves with names. So the world must become their memorial. Every classroom that dares to teach what really happened. Every voice that says their story out loud without looking away. That's how history heals, if it ever does. Not by closure, but by witness. By the living saying to the dead, "We see you now." And maybe that's what keeps the key from rusting away completely. The idea that somewhere, in the tangled roots of Burke County, the locked door it once opened is still there. Not waiting to be entered. Waiting to be understood. And if one day someone finds it, under the moss, under the weight of centuries, maybe the door won't lead to a basement or a room full of records. Maybe it'll open inward, into us. Into the part of humanity that builds systems and then swears they were mercy. Into the part that looks at horror and calls it legacy. That's the real Thornhill. Not a plantation, not a ruin, but a mirror. And when we finally face what stares back, we'll know that the story never wanted to haunt us. It wanted to warn us. So listen when the wind moves through old pine. Listen when the past knocks softly against the walls of your certainty. Because it's not asking for fear, it's asking for honesty. And that, perhaps, is the truest ending of all. Thornhill isn't gone. It's awake. And it's watching what we build next. Because what we build next, that's where history tests us. Burke County looks different now. The dirt roads are paved, the fields parceled into housing tracts and convenience stores. New families have moved in, with no reason to suspect that beneath their lawns lie fragments of a world that once turned human life into arithmetic. Children ride bikes where overseers once rode horses. Parents barbecue on weekends, and the smoke curls up through the same air that once carried the cries of people who were told their blood wasn't their own. The land pretends to forget, but the ground never really does. Sometimes the forgetting is willful, polite silence disguised as peace. Sometimes it's survival, the body's way of saying, we've carried enough pain. But memory isn't a curse. It's an instruction, a compass pointing toward responsibility. That's what Evelyn Gray believed. Her students remember how she'd end her lectures. History isn't what happened, it's what still happens when no one's looking. And in places like Thornhill, that truth breathes louder than anywhere else. Because the same machinery that Catherine Thornhill built out of desperation and control, the idea that human worth can be engineered, measured, owned, has never disappeared. It simply changed its name. Now it hides in algorithms that decide who gets a loan or a job. It hides in zip codes that predict how long you'll live. It hides in systems that call themselves neutral while quietly deciding who is allowed to dream. That's why the story endures, not as Gothic horror, but as prophecy. Because every time we create a system that values power more than empathy, we pick up her pen. We start a new ledger. We call it progress. But progress without conscience is just Thornhill wearing modern clothes. So maybe the haunting we feel isn't supernatural at all. Maybe it's the sound of unfinished accountability, the whisper of every erased name asking, "What will you do with the world we left you?" In 2035, a memorial was quietly approved by the Burke County Historical Society, a simple iron sculpture in a clearing surrounded by longleaf pines. It bears no photograph of Catherine Thornhill, no house, no grandeur, only a ring of 23 small bronze figures, children holding hands, their faces upturned to a blank sky. At the center, engraved in steel, are 4 words: "We were her blood." No one cut a ribbon. No one gave a speech. It was installed at dawn, in silence, the way you lay flowers on a grave you've just learned belongs to you. When the first sunlight touched the figures, their bronze skin shimmered faintly green. The caretaker swears it was just reflection, but those who stood there say it looked like 23 pairs of pale eyes waking to morning. They say the air changed, not heavy, not mournful, just clear. Like something had finally been said aloud that had been waiting 170 years to be heard. That's how the story ends, if it ends at all. Not with vengeance, not with forgiveness, but with clarity. And if you ever find yourself there, standing among those trees, the wind whispering through the metal figures like breath, remember this. The past is not asking you to feel guilty. It's asking you to stay awake, to see how quickly cruelty can turn into custom, and how easily custom can look like order. Because every era has its Catherine Thornhill, and every generation must decide whether to follow her or to stop the pen mid-sentence. That's the real inheritance. Not blood, not legacy, choice. And the story, their story, isn't finished until you choose what kind of ancestor you want to be. And if you're still here, still reading, still breathing with this story, then you've already begun that choice. Because staying until the end, refusing to look away, is an act of defiance in itself. Most people turn back before now. They reach the point where Thornhill's ghosts stop being history and start being reflection, and they retreat into the comfort of distance. But distance is a privilege the past never gave its victims. To face Thornhill honestly is to stand in front of the mirror it holds up, the one that doesn't just show Catherine Danforth Thornhill or her house or her ledgers. It shows us, our cities, our systems, our quiet compromises. The plantation may be gone, but the idea of Thornhill, the hunger for control disguised as order, moves through time like a genetic code, passed down in policies and institutions, waiting for a host willing to justify it again. So if you ever ask what became of Thornhill, understand this: it never vanished. It adapted. It's in every boardroom where decisions are made about who gets access and who gets forgotten. It's in every algorithm trained on biased data that claims to be neutral. It's in every prison built on the same soil that once held slave quarters. It's in the quiet assumption that suffering is a natural cost of prosperity. That's Thornhill, whispering through the machinery of the modern world, smooth, rational, unfeeling, still breeding compliance, still harvesting obedience, still calling it progress. But the story doesn't end there, because the descendants, the real legacy of Thornhill, are not the children Catherine tried to create. They are the ones who refused to carry her logic forward. They are the survivors who rebuilt their lives out of ruins and silence, and the generations after them who turned trauma into testimony. Some of them became teachers, some became ministers, musicians, soldiers, doctors. Some changed their names, not to hide, but to start anew. They never spoke the word Thornhill, but the resilience in their bones, the defiance in their very existence, was the truest undoing of the woman who tried to claim them as property. That's the irony history hides so well. Catherine Thornhill dreamed of creating a bloodline that could never escape her control. But what she really created was a bloodline that could never be controlled again. Every act of survival, every birth, every song, every prayer spoken in freedom, became a rebellion written into the very DNA she thought she owned. That is the final chapter she never intended to write. And maybe, if she could see beyond her own madness, she'd understand that her greatest failure was not her death, or the ruin of her estate, or the silence of the county that erased her. Her greatest failure was that she built a machine to produce obedience, and instead, it produced memory. Memory that traveled, memory that evolved, memory that refused to die. It lives in every descendant who walks this earth unaware of her name, but carrying the proof of survival in their very breath. It lives in every scholar, every artist, every voice that refuses to let power disguise itself as progress. It lives in you, reading this now, because by witnessing it, you've become part of the resistance to forgetting. And maybe that's the truest ending Thornhill could ever have. Not the ruins, not the bones, not the green-eyed children in the basement. But this moment, right now, where the story is no longer hers. It belongs to the living, to the ones who remember, and the ones who dare to understand. And understanding is the beginning of undoing. So if you carry anything from this, let it be this truth. Evil is never ancient. It's only ever waiting for permission to start again. And memory, honest, unflinching, human memory, is the only thing that can stop it. So speak their names, even if history won't. Tell their story, even if your voice shakes, because silence is the only grave evil ever really needs. And stories like Thornhill, they are the shovels that dig it back out. The past isn't over, it's a door. And now, you hold the key. The truth is, doors like Thornhill don't close. They linger half open, creaking whenever someone touches the handle. Walk through, and the air changes. It smells like clay after rain, like something old trying to breathe again. You start to realize that the story isn't about a single woman or even a single place. It's about what happens when people mistake control for safety, when fear of loss becomes a blueprint for cruelty. Stand long enough on that red soil, and the world around you starts to layer itself. The 1800s flicker behind the 2000s. The sound of children at play overlaps with the faint scrape of shovels in the distance. The land is teaching you how thin time really is. Maybe that's why the locals say the hollow hums at night. Not ghosts, not vengeance, just the vibration of history refusing to stay flat. Every story that's ever been buried pushes upward eventually. You can hear it in the low thunder that rolls through Georgia summers, in the way power lines buzz when storms gather. Some evenings, when the light tilts gold, the figures at the memorial cast long shadows across the clearing. The shadows of those bronze children touch the trunks of the pines, stretch past the fence line, crawl into the town itself, as if reminding everyone that remembrance doesn't stop at a monument. There's a bench nearby now, small and unmarked. Someone carved into it, not neatly, but with the insistence of a pocket knife, "Never again," in silence. No one knows who did it. The caretakers decided to leave the words. They fit. Every October, the local school holds a candle walk there. The students recite from letters and diary fragments. The teachers read from Evelyn Gray's notes. At the end, they lower their candles into glass jars and set them along the path home. Each flame reflects in the next, a chain of light leading away from the darkness. That's what remembering looks like when it's done right. Not spectacle, not horror, but responsibility made visible. Because the goal was never to build another myth. It was to make sure no one could ever again hide what was real. And maybe, in the quiet that follows, that's what you start to feel. Not fear, but inheritance. The kind that asks something of you. The story of Thornhill doesn't end with Catherine's fall, or with the memorial, or even with this telling. It ends, if it ever does, every time someone decides that decency will not be negotiated, that empathy will not be rationed, that no ledger will ever again turn people into property. When that choice becomes ordinary, when compassion stops being rebellion and becomes reflex, then, finally, the soil might rest. Until then, the wind through the pines keeps whispering the same warning over and over, like a heartbeat beneath the world. Remember, what was done here. Remember who ended it, and remember what it cost. Maybe that's why the wind sounds almost like language if you stand there long enough. The cadence of something ancient, measured, patient. It isn't mourning, it's instruction. Because Thornhill, for all its horror, was never just a tragedy. It was a lesson about what happens when one human being decides she has the right to define another's worth, and then writes it down as law. And that lesson didn't die with Catherine Thornhill. It became part of the air we breathe. You can still see traces of it in the way we talk about power today, in the way some lives are counted and others are merely accounted for. We speak of management, efficiency, optimization, and forget how easily those words once justified entire systems of cruelty. That's the echo of Thornhill, polished now, dressed in progress, but humming with the same low note of control. When Evelyn Gray's former students return to the site, they bring their own children. They don't tell ghost stories. They talk about cause and effect, how the smallest cruelty, left unchecked, grows roots deep enough to strangle a century. They tell their children to listen to the ground, not for voices, but for warnings. A few years ago, the county placed a plaque at the memorial. It doesn't describe the horrors in detail. It doesn't name Catherine or even the estate. It simply reads, "Here we learned what forgetting costs." Every year people leave offerings, not grand things, just personal ones. A child's marble, a keychain, a single note folded into the dirt. One of them, washed half open by rain, said, "My grandmother said our eyes come from the woman who thought she owned us. But we see through them now. We see everything." It's strange how history turns. The very traits Catherine tried to claim as hers, becoming proof that she failed to own anything at all. Her legacy outlived her, yes, but it no longer obeys her. It breathes, questions, teaches. And maybe that's how the story redeems itself, not by forgiveness, but by reversal. What was once designed to imprison now illuminates. What was meant to silence now speaks. In that way, Thornhill never needed a ghost. The land itself became conscience, a living archive reminding anyone who listens that no system, however powerful, survives being remembered honestly. So when the next storm rolls over Burke County and thunder cracks like the slamming of a long-closed door, imagine, just for a second, that it isn't anger you're hearing. It's warning. It's endurance. It's the sound of 23 voices reminding the living what happens when truth is buried too long. And maybe one day, when every classroom teaches stories like this without fear or denial, the wind will change its tone. Maybe then it will finally sound like peace. Maybe that day isn't as far away as it feels. Because change doesn't always announce itself with headlines or monuments. Sometimes it starts as a quiet decision, a teacher refusing to skip a page, a child asking why, a family choosing to remember out loud what everyone else decided was too heavy to hold. That's how Thornhill begins to loosen its grip on the world, not by erasure, but by conversation, by people deciding, together, that the truth, however painful, is less dangerous than silence. In recent years, the land around the memorial has started to grow wildflowers again, naturally without planting. Poppies, mostly, and yellow oxeye daisies. The botanists can't explain it. The soil's acidity should kill anything delicate. But every spring, the flowers return. Their stems push through the same clay that once buried the children. Some call it coincidence. Others call it apology. And each year, the community gathers not for mourning, but for storytelling. They bring instruments, drums, fiddles, guitars, and they play. Not dirges, music full of light. Songs about surviving, about persistence, about laughter that refuses to die even when the world demands silence. It isn't a festival, it's more sacred than it's reclamation through joy. The final rebellion against everything Thornhill stood for. An elder woman named Ruthie Carver leads the circle each year. She's small, wiry, voice like smoke over pine. Her great-grandmother was born on the Thornhill property after the war. Ruthie always begins the same way, standing before the crowd, eyes closed, one hand on her chest. We are here because somebody once said we weren't supposed to be, but we are, and that's the miracle. The crowd echoes her words. Then she sings, an old hymn reimagined as a promise. Ain't no legacy gonna chain me down. The sound travels through the trees, through the ruins, through the open air. And for a moment, you can almost believe that the land itself exhales. Because maybe that's the quiet truth of all haunted places. They're not waiting for vengeance. They're waiting for understanding. Catherine Thornhill built her world on fear and possession, but those who came after built theirs on memory and defiance. And each generation moves the story a little further from her shadow, until one day, perhaps, her name will mean nothing at all. When that happens, the story will finally belong entirely to the children, to those 23 small hands joined forever in the dark, who became the beginning of something brighter than their captor could have imagined. One historian once said that history has two hearts, one that beats for what was lost, and one that beats for what survived. Thornhill belongs to the second. So when you leave the memorial and step back onto the road, don't look for ghosts. Look for life, resilient, radiant, messy, unbowed life. The hum of cicadas, the sound of a train in the distance, the laughter of children carried on the wind. That's what victory looks like after centuries of silence. And maybe, if you pause before you go, you'll notice that the wind through the pines no longer sounds like warning. It sounds like breathing. It sounds like peace, slowly, finally, learning how to speak. Because peace, real peace, isn't quiet, it's alive. It hums beneath the surface of things, where roots weave through the bones of what used to be. And that's what Burke County has become. Not a haunted field, not a scar on a map, but a living conversation on between past and present. Each spring, when the flowers bloom at Thornhill, children from the local schools gather to read out names, not just of the enslaved, but of every person whose story was taken, twisted, or erased by time. Some of the names are guesses. Some are fragments from letters, others taken from faded Bible margins or ledger lines that once reduced people to property. But spoken aloud, those names sound like restoration. The children's voices rise into the morning air, small but sure, stitching memory back into the fabric of the land. Afterward, they scatter petals over the soil. The petals stick to the damp clay, red on red, like blood turned into offering. And as the wind carries them off, the elders watching from the edge of the clearing sometimes cry, not from grief, but from relief. Because at last, the story isn't being whispered in corners. It's being told in daylight. One of the local pastors, Reverend Harlan Reeves, always closes the ceremony the same way. He steps forward, Bible in one hand, and says, God doesn't punish us with memory. He trusts us with it. It's a simple line, but it changes something every time he says it. Because memory isn't a burden. It's a responsibility, a seed meant to grow into empathy, not shame. The Thornhill site has no fences now. The county removed them after the memorial was built. The path that leads through the pines is open, lined with benches, each engraved with a single word. Listen, learn, remember, begin. Visitors leave all kinds of things there. Handwritten poems, locks of hair, a jar of soil from other places with similar histories, Louisiana, Mississippi, the Carolinas, so the land can mingle, heal together. Sometimes they leave nothing at all but a moment of silence, which is its own kind of offering. And on certain evenings, when the last light burns gold across the field, the air changes again. Not heavy, not haunted, just full. Full of every life that passed through it. Full of every truth that refused to stay buried. The historians say Thornhill has finally been mapped properly now. They've placed it on official records, marked its borders, documented its ruins. But what can't be measured is what it's become. A testament to transformation. A reminder that even the darkest stories, when told with honesty, can grow light out of their own ash. Because in the end, Thornhill isn't about Catherine Thornhill anymore. It's about what the people she tried to erase built from her destruction. They turned her experiment into endurance. They turned her cruelty into connection. They turned her silence into a song that still rises every spring, carried by voices too strong to ever be caged again. And if you go there, if you stand among the wild flowers and the wind, you'll see it, not with your eyes, but with your bones. The understanding that everything we bury, truth, pain, humanity, will one day find its way back to the surface. Because the earth does not forget. It remembers, not to haunt us, but to hold us accountable. And if we listen closely, if we stay brave enough to keep remembering, maybe that's what redemption really sounds like, a field of flowers growing from the graves of children who were once told they were nothing, singing softly but endlessly. We are still here. And over the years that quiet chorus, we are still here, became something more than memory. It became a rhythm, a heartbeat in the county's soil. A reminder that every act of remembrance is also an act of rebuilding. People began to come from farther away, historians, artists, travelers, the curious and the grieving. They didn't come for spectacle. They came to stand in that clearing and feel the difference between silence and peace. Because Thornhill, at last, had stopped whispering like a wound. It had started to breathe like a lesson. The community built a small visitor center nearby. It's simple, wood, glass, open air. Inside, the walls are lined with panels of text, excerpts from letters, fragments of journals, testimonies from descendants. But the curators made one deliberate choice: no glass cases, no relics of horror, only words, faces, and the hum of recorded voices, real people reading history aloud. One voice, that of Ruthie Carver, fills the final room. The recording begins softly, her accent thick and steady. They used to say the land was cursed, but I say the curse was silence. And look what happened once we started talking. You can hear a smile in her voice, then a pause. Then she adds, "If you want to know whether a people are free, listen to what they're willing to remember." That line alone keeps visitors standing still long after the recording ends, because it turns the story back toward them, toward us. Freedom isn't just the absence of chains. It's the courage to look backward without flinching. It's the act of refusing to hand the next generation a clean, false past. Outside, the path continues into the trees. It winds past a small pond, and beside it, a new plaque rests in the grass. It reads, "To those who were called seed, but grew into forest." No one signs it, no need. The meaning belongs to everyone now. And so, Thornhill stands, not as a scar, but as a mirror. Every generation that comes to it finds something different reflected back: guilt, pride, grief, resolve. And each of those reflections adds another layer to the story, proof that the past is not a chain dragging us backward, but a root that keeps us steady as we move forward. The county holds an annual dusk vigil now. They light 23 lanterns, one for each child found in that basement so long ago, and send them drifting across the pond. The lights bob gently, reflections trembling on the water. For a moment, it looks as if the stars themselves have descended to rest in the reeds. Children laugh softly. Elders hum the old hymns. Fireflies mingle with lanterns until you can't tell which is which. And that's when it happens. The transformation no one can quite explain. For just a breath, all sound falls away. The frogs hush, the wind stills, and the lanterns seem to hover in the air, as if held there by something unseen. Then the wind returns, carrying a faint murmur through the trees. Not words, not ghosts, but something unmistakably alive. Hope, perhaps, or forgiveness, whispered in the language of the earth. When the lanterns finally fade, only darkness and starlight remain. But the people stay for a while, standing together in silence that feels not like loss, but like completion. Because they understand now what took more than a century to learn. You can't erase what happened here. You can only choose what it becomes. And in that choice, the choice to remember, to rebuild, to rise, the Thornhill children finally win. They are no longer trapped in that basement, no longer secrets buried beneath red clay. They are voices in wind, color in bloom, names carried forward in love instead of shame. So when you leave the clearing and look back one last time, don't say goodbye. Say thank you. Because stories like Thornhill's don't survive, so we can grieve. They survive, so we can learn how never to repeat them. And that is how the past, at long last, becomes something sacred, not a curse, not a cage, but a promise. And the promise, that's the part no one forgets. Because promises, once spoken into the air, take root the way seeds do. They find cracks in the hardest ground, and they wait. Years, decades, whole lifetimes, if they have to, but they wait. The Thornhill promise is simple. Never let the powerful rename cruelty as order. Every generation in Burke County has carried some version of it. It's painted on a mural downtown now, bright colors on old brick. High school kids designed it themselves. Hands joined across a field of red and gold, a single oak tree growing from a book instead of soil. Beneath it, in bold black paint, are just two words: we remember. That mural faces the courthouse, directly across from the steps where slave auctions once took place. It stands as both defiance and declaration that the story is no longer hidden in basements or whispered in kitchens. It's part of the landscape now, unerasable. The town has changed. There's a small museum that holds oral histories, a walking tour through the remnants of old plantations, and a new curriculum in the county schools that begins with a single question printed in large letters on the first page. Who gets to decide what is remembered? Students write essays, draw maps, trace family lines. Some discover ancestors they didn't know existed. Others find the courage to ask their parents questions that have gone unspoken for generations. And when they visit Thornhill each spring, it isn't as spectators. It's as caretakers. They sweep the paths, polish the plaques, replace fallen flowers. They sit in circles beneath the pines, reading poems and stories they've written, stories not of horror, but of endurance. One girl, no older than 13, once stood up during the ceremony and read aloud, "Mistress said we were her legacy, but we're not her blood anymore. We're our own." The crowd fell silent. For a long moment, even the wind seemed to listen. That's what healing looks like. Not erasure, not forgetting, but transformation. The ability to speak back to the ghosts without fear. The same children Catherine Thornhill once dreamed would carry her name now carry her undoing instead. And maybe that's what justice really is. Not punishment, but reversal. The turning of a story, so that what was once a weapon becomes a lesson. At night, when the stars hang low over the clearing, you can see the bronze figures of the children glowing faintly under the moonlight. They don't look trapped anymore. They look like they're walking, hand in hand, heads lifted toward the horizon. Some visitors swear that if you stand close enough, you can hear something faint beneath the sound of the leaves, a heartbeat, steady and low. Maybe it's the wind, or maybe it's the earth remembering that life continues even after centuries of silence. Before you leave the site, there's a small wooden sign near the path. It doesn't quote scripture or history. It simply says, "You are standing where forgetting ended." And maybe that's what the whole story has been leading to. Not horror, not tragedy, but that single moment of clarity. The moment when the living finally stop averting their eyes. When they say aloud, "We see what was done, and we will not look away again." Because that's how the world changes. Not all at once, not through miracles or grand speeches, but through small acts of witness that echo louder than any silence. And in that echo, in that long, steady sound of truth carried by time, the Thornhill children finally find their peace. Not because they were avenged, but because they were remembered. And as long as their story is told, as long as one person still stands in that field and whispers, "We are still here," the promise holds. In the years that followed, the promise began to take shape in ways no one could have predicted, not just as remembrance, but as renewal. Artists came from across the South to paint murals of the Thornhill children, not as victims, but as visionaries. One artist, a descendant of the original families freed after the war, painted them standing on a shoreline, staring toward a sunrise. Each child held a lantern, and inside each flame, faintly, a symbol glowed, a key, the same key that had once been found buried in the red clay. He titled the piece, "The Door That Never Locked," and when he unveiled it, he said quietly, "I think we were never meant to open the door she built. We were meant to build new ones." The audience fell silent, and for a long moment it felt like the air itself understood him, because that's what Thornhill had become, a kind of hinge between centuries. On one side, the cold precision of Catherine's order, on the other, the wild, unpredictable bloom of freedom. The door she tried to seal with control had cracked open into something infinite: art, learning, empathy, resilience. Every April now, during the day of reckoning and renewal, descendants from all over Georgia gather at the site. They come with stories, music, and food: collards, cornbread, sweet tea, okra stew. They share family histories and speak their ancestors' names out loud, voices layered into a harmony that rolls across the fields. Somewhere in that sound is sorrow. Yes, but there's laughter too, and gratitude, and even joy. Because grief doesn't always end in silence. Sometimes it ends in song. The local schools added something new to their curriculum that year: the Thornhill Ethics Project. It's not about the plantation. It's about the question of power. Students debate the same question their teacher once posed: what would you do if the world gave you control over others? They study history, science, politics, but the final assignment is always the same: design a system that uplifts rather than exploits. Some design community farms. Others create online archives for forgotten histories. A few build digital art projects, reimagining the faces of the Thornhill children in motion, smiling, laughing, growing up the way they never got to. And every year one student leaves a note by the memorial before graduation. They're never signed, but they always say some version of the same thing: I understand now. We're the ones who keep the door open. The people of Burke County have started calling that clearing the breathing field. They say it's because in the evenings the air there moves differently, like the land itself is exhaling after holding its breath for more than a century. Visitors notice it too. You can stand in the middle of the field, feel the soft rush of wind circling around you, and it almost feels like a heartbeat, steady and low. That's when you realize something. Thornhill isn't gone. It's been rewritten. Not by Catherine, not by the soldiers who opened those basement doors, but by everyone who chose to speak the story instead of bury it again. And maybe that's what history really wants from us. Not guilt, not fear, but courage. The courage to open old doors, look inside, and carry the truth forward without letting it chain us. Because every era will build its own Thornhill if it isn't careful. The names will change, the walls will look different, but the temptation to control, to categorize, to claim, will always return. That's why the field remains. Not as a grave, but as a reminder that every generation must choose again and again between control and compassion. And if you listen closely, beneath the whisper of the trees, the wind still carries a voice, not of warning anymore, but of welcome, soft, patient, and steady as breath. We are still here, it says. Now what will you build? So maybe this is where it ends. Not with a scream, or a curse, or even an answer, but with a question the living have to carry. Because every story, like Thornhill, leaves a key behind. A choice. To forget and let the pattern repeat, or to remember and change what memory means. Catherine Thornhill tried to build eternity through control. But eternity doesn't belong to those who take. It belongs to those who endure, those who remember. And that's what the children of Thornhill became. Not ghosts, not shadows, but echoes that grew louder than the silence that tried to bury them. They became a language the earth could finally speak. Now the land breathes again. The flowers grow. The soil forgives, but it never forgets. And the people who walk there, teachers, descendants, wanderers, they know something sacred now. That history's weight is not meant to crush us, it's meant to shape us. Because when the past is finally faced, when the truth is spoken aloud and met with courage instead of denial, that's when darkness loses its hold. That's when the dead rest. That's when the living rise. So if you ever find yourself standing in that Georgia field, beneath the slow hum of cicadas and the trembling light of dusk, stop. Close your eyes. Listen. You'll hear the faintest sound, soft as breath, steady as a heartbeat. It isn't fear. It isn't sorrow. It's the sound of the world remembering what it almost forgot. It's the sound of peace, finally earned. And somewhere, beneath that red clay, 23 small voices whisper one last time, "We are free." Tell them we're free.